Okay, I love this. All I had to do was wind you up with one question and you covered so much. This is really good. I love how you painted that too for our audience so they can really travel with you. I'm going to read some of these questions and then you may have already answered it. You may not have. Some of it may be just in there. But
Yeah.
like this book here, Robert P. Carroll's book on When Prophecy Failed,
Yeah.
Cognitive Dissonance Studies. You highly recommended this. It's a little dry, but it's still good. Robert P. Carroll spoke about the Jeremiah 18 conditional prophecy from God. Carroll calls it unrealistic and utopian. It images or imagines a contract-like relationship where God will bless the Israelites if they do certain things, but curse them if they don't. It appears this leads to the development of later apocalyptic thinking for righteous Jews who aren't seeing the results of this contract and imagine God is going to fulfill the promises to Israel deterministically. You've already kind of mentioned that there's a change happening, but my third question that goes into that second one is there any Jewish literature where righteous Jews are being judged or nations rule them or things aren't seemingly good, they're not getting blessed, things bad are happening to Israel, and they're not getting the good into the stick, and they're writing about this, and they're saying, where are you, God? You're not acting. You said you were going to keep this contract of like, if I do good, good will happen. Is there ever any Jews that ever do that? And then eventually they start making the contract not conditional. They make it deterministic.
Well, I think, if you read through the Psalms, how long, O Lord? It's a very typical thing in the Psalms. One of the main kinds of psalm is the lament and the complaint. And a lot of what goes into the complaint is, why are you letting this happen to me? How long are you going to let this happen to me? And so you want repentance? I will abase myself. We have sinned, we've done wrong, but now, okay, get over it. So that's very, very typical. Now, did that contribute to the rise of apocalypticism? I mean, to this degree, I would say yes, that if you're not getting the results in this life, then you must be going to get them in the next life. I think that's a huge factor in the belief in the judgment of the dead. It's the demand for justice. And since it's so obvious that we don't get justice in this life, surely there must be another life where we will get it.
Of course.
That's the logic there. So that feeds into it. Now, do you ever get to the point where God will just bless Israel unconditionally? I don't think so. Not in the material that I work with. I mean, not in the material down through the end of the New Testament period. Because one of the shifts again that happens with apocalyptic literature is that it's not like, for a prophet like Amos, if God is going to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, he's going to do it indiscriminately. In other words, if you happen to be in Samaria when the Assyrians come, tough, you may be the best person in the world, but that isn't going to save you. If you're on the Titanic, you're going down. There's no way out of that. Now, when you get to the apocalyptic literature, no, the righteous ones will be saved. There will be a lifeboat that will come for the righteous ones, and the wicked ones will go down. That's the way. So there's a split within Israel that you get already in the book of Daniel. You have the wise and the righteous who rise to everlasting life, and then you have those who rise to shame and everlasting contempt. And they will include some of Israel, and the fact that they are Israelites is not going to save them. That's how that works.
Okay, so now that you've painted a picture, and we have, not everything is seen the same way, especially the Son of Man, for example. You can look at the literature and go, holy smokes, are we reading 1 Enoch? Are we reading Daniel? What are we reading in Second Temple Judaism? And there are various ways to try and look at this text. And then we get into Mark. And obviously, I want this interview to lead into NT Wright, of course, eventually. And I'll even share an image that Paula Fredrickson said in critiquing his Paul and the faithfulness of God. I'm just going to say this anyway. She said, I just came from Boston, by the way. I interviewed her. We did like 16 interviews in person. The same way I came to you the week you were retiring and I sat in your office. I did this to her at her apartment. And she said, can we save the question on NT Wright for the end so I don't ruin my day yet? This is what she said to me. So I was like, okay, I'll wait till the end to bring up the NT Wright stuff. And well, I think we're going to do this too. So bringing up the question on Jesus, right? We were talking about conditionality and then just getting into apocalypticism and eschatology. How do we apply the current contemporaneous first century, if you will, understanding of apocalypticism and eschatology to Jesus? And how do we see that as failed? Did Jesus see his prophecies as being like conditional or deterministic? Did Paul see his prophecies as conditional or deterministic? Like, I guess what I'm getting at is, was Jesus and Paul wrong, and how do we know it?
Well, I'd first of all rephrase the question a little bit. There is no agreement as to whether Jesus talked about the end at all.
In the real Jesus.
If we focus here on Mark 13.
Okay.
Is that telling us something that Jesus actually said? Maybe, maybe not. You know, I'm open to the possibility of it. I'm not really deeply convinced one way or the other. I think some people don't want Jesus to have said that. It makes him sound like a fundamentalist. But, you know, he was a person of his time. But now there's certainly lots of things in the Gospels that Jesus didn't say. And for that of it, if you compare the Gospels carefully, he can't have said it all. You know, unless he was given to repeating himself with some significant variations.
Right.
So it's not so much Jesus we're talking about as, say, Mark.
Right.
Now, I don't know if that makes anybody feel better. But now, in the case of Paul, Paul doesn't have a get out of jail card. Paul is stuck with it. And Paul actually, you know, in the case of Paul, you've got some quite explicit things that he says that indicate that Paul expected that within a generation, we will not all die, but we will all be changed. That Christ would come on the clouds within a generation. And so that, you know, this was going to happen. Now, was he wrong? Yeah, unless you think this has happened. Now, if it has happened, well, we missed a big one.
I like this. This is a perfect time to bring an image up. I have to bring Paula's image up here. Okay. So she's reviewing NT Wright here, and NT Wright wants to get into realized eschatology, which I hope that you and me can cover briefly. But what about all those cosmic powers, every arche, exousia, dynamos, whom the victorious returning Christ had yet to defeat? 1 Corinthians 15:24. The theos of this aeon, who was blinding the minds of unbelievers, 2 Corinthians 4:4. The archai and dynamis, that groan along with all creation, 8:38. The resurrection of the dead and the transformation of the living, which Paul thought he would live to see. Aren't these hopes, well, apocalyptic? Wouldn't the day, I love this phrase, wouldn't the day after the day of the Lord Jesus Christ look a little different from the day before? She's so good with words. Is it really metaphors all the way down, transposed into a realized Christological key? Or is Paul talking about something actually historically, indeed empirically happening within the time-space world? Enough about that. But like, it seems like we're trying to get around a problem. And isn't that what realized eschatology is, Dr. Collins?
Trying to get around a problem? Well, maybe you should be a little more explicit as to just what you mean by realized eschatology. Because, you know, you will get, when you say realized eschatology, the first thing that comes to my mind is the Gospel of John. You know, he who believes in me will not die, but has already passed from death to life. In other words, you may not know it, but you're already in heaven. You're already living the blessed life.
Right.
Now, there were people who thought that. There were people in the Dead Sea Scrolls who thought like that, who thought they were already with the angels singing the praises of God. So that's a phenomenon. Now, do I think they were? Well, I mean, it's a state of mind, if you like. They had that state of mind. Obviously, I don't think they were actually in heaven with the angels, but again, heaven may well be a state of mind. So, there's nothing wrong, I think, with realized eschatology in that sense. The problem with NT Wright, I think, apropos of something like the Gospel of Mark or Paul, is that he wants to eliminate the real future expectation. And this I don't think works. And part of it, it's very easy to do it with Paul, and Paul does that very well because Paul is so explicit about it. And Paul lays out for you his assumptions about the nature of the world. But equally here, you had pointed out to me in one of these questions a passage in Mark 13.
Yes, 24 through 27. Is it speaking of the parousia or the destruction of the Jerusalem temple?
He's talking about the parousia, I think. Now, the destruction of the Jerusalem temple might have come along with that. It might even have been the occasion of it. But this doesn't get away from seeing the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory.
Mm-hmm.
Now, part of the background here that misleads, may I say gently, NT Wright, is that there's a tradition of British scholarship that some British scholars would refer shamelessly to common sense. By common sense, they meant the way we think. There was a student once who had studied with George Caird. I think it was that was Oxford or Cambridge. But his kind of parody of George Caird was, horses couldn't possibly like grass. Do you like grass? I don't like grass. Why would you think horses do? Now, it's a bit like that, so I don't believe that Christ is going to come on the clouds of heaven. So how could the early Christians have believed it? They too must have had British common sense. Now, in the case of the Son of Man in Daniel, then there's a long-standing line of interpretation that thought this is the Jewish people collective, right, and the holy ones of the Most High are the Jewish people. Well, now, if you have had the stamina to wade through my commentary on Daniel or the relevant part of it, I think that's just dead wrong. If you're familiar with the literature of the time, you know that holy ones are angels. I think there's maybe one verse in the Psalms where the holy ones might possibly refer to Israel. But there were hundreds of references, including many in the book of Daniel. At one point, he hears one holy one talking to another. They're obviously angels. And in Daniel 4, a watcher and a holy one comes down from heaven. Holy ones are angels. And a figure riding on the clouds in the Hebrew Bible, and this actually was pointed out by an English scholar who was atypical of British scholarship in this respect. John Emerton was his name. But he pointed out that in the Hebrew Bible, apart from this passage in Daniel, it is always Yahweh, the God of Israel, who is the rider of the clouds. Then when nearly 100 years ago, people found texts at Ugarit in northern Syria, they found that back 1,000 years before the Hebrew Bible, Baal was the rider of the clouds, the storm god. But riding on the clouds is a mark of divinity. Now, when I say divinity, I'm not using that word in a monotheistic sense, but there are two kinds of beings. There are divine and human. And what we call angels nowadays, well, this is just a soft way of, very often, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they call them gods, Elim. So the figure riding on the clouds is a god. Not the Most High, but not just a human being. He looks like a human being. You don't say that human beings look like human beings.
Good one.
Very few of them do, anyway.
Yeah, some are questionable.
Yes, yeah.
But yeah, so okay,
yeah.
this was,
I think, part of what misled Tom Wright.
Right, because you were emphasizing that he was interpreting it in the first century under the Markan context as the people of Israel. He tried to kind of metaphorize this to be about the people of Israel rather than an individual whom Jesus is really trying in the context, or really Mark is really trying to say that Jesus is calling himself, which is really a big red flag of why, like, would he really have been saying this of himself? We're not sure. Was he a fanatic or?
And also, if he said, "You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven," that doesn't automatically mean you will see me coming on the clouds of heaven. There was an interesting character in New York about 25 years ago named Menachem Schneerson. Have you heard of him?
No.
He was a Hasidic Rebbe, and I remember seeing a full-page ad on the back page of the New York Times with a picture of Schneerson saying, "The Rebbe says the Moshiach is on his way." Now, Schneerson never said, "I am the Messiah," but a lot of his followers believed he was. And after he died, I also remember I saw this with my own eyes, eyewitness testimony, outside the airport in Tel Aviv, a big billboard with a picture of Schneerson. He's coming back. Now, the reason I bring him up is that Jesus could very well have spoken about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, alluding to Daniel, and without making clear whether he was identifying himself with him or who he thought he was. And there was obviously a certain amount of speculation in Judaism as to who this figure that Daniel talked about was. In the similitudes of Enoch, he's not, well, I think in Daniel, he's the archangel Michael. And that becomes clear at the end of the book because when the battle is over, it's Michael who rises in victory. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, God is to raise up Israel among all flesh and Michael among the gods. Michael is kind of the heavenly patron or the heavenly prince, as they call him in Daniel, of Israel. So, but now in the similitudes of Enoch, it's not Michael, but it's somebody even higher up. Definitely, a godlike figure. And in some other texts, he's a messianic figure. So there was a lot of uncertainty as to just who this figure was. Now, the followers of Jesus at some point decided that Jesus was the one. Now, could they have decided that before his death? This, I think, is one of the, million-dollar questions in the New Testament. But I'm putting it now in terms of what people could possibly have thought or understood, not in terms of what Jesus meant. But if you just look at this from one of the disciples' point of view, while Jesus was walking around in Galilee or in Jerusalem, why would anyone think he was going to come on the clouds of heaven? He was already there. So I think the idea that Jesus was this Son of Man only makes sense if you believe that he has been taken up to heaven. And that doesn't happen until after his death. With the
Got it.
resurrection. Now, I think that at least is how the idea would have taken hold in early Christianity, whatever Jesus meant. So, in theory, it's possible that he was saying all this in coded language and leaving it for them to figure out later, perhaps. And it's also, in theory, possible that he didn't say that at all, but that his disciples made him say it afterwards. And, I don't really have a strong conclusion on that. I would not at all exclude the possibility that Jesus might have talked about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Several people in the first century talked about the Son of Man. They were just reading the book of Daniel. That's where they were getting it from. But they in the first century, nobody thought that the one like a Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven was Israel. It was clearly an individual, a God-like individual. You don't find the collective interpretation for several hundred years afterwards. I think it comes up first in one of the Syriac writers, maybe about 400.
Okay, so you bring up one more thing, and then we'll get to Q&A for anyone who wants to ask interesting questions. About that issue, I've had conversations with some recent friends. They're Christian apologists as well, but we have like these discussions when we need to burn time, and we kind of wrestle with ideas together, but we're open-minded to like have these conversations. And it was like what you brought up. Did Jesus think this of himself? Could he have? Maybe. But is there any other examples that we have of Jewish men claiming to be the Son of Man, or even pretending in some way that they were going to, be riding on the clouds of heaven or anything like that during their lifetime?
Not that I can think of. Now, we get examples of Jewish men who were hailed as Messiah and who claimed to be Messiah, I think you could probably say. Yeah, the best known of these was Bar Kokhba, who led a revolt against Rome about 100 years after Jesus. But Messiah, the Messiah was always understood to be a human being. He might be Son of God, but he was also a human being. But did anybody claim to be a heavenly being incarnate? I don't think so. In the similitudes of Enoch, the Son of Man does not come on earth. He only appears as a heavenly being at the final judgment. He has no earthly career.
I thought he was Enoch. I thought Enoch was the Son of Man in one of the places in the one Enoch.
Well, there's a passage at the end of the similitudes. It starts out. I didn't bring the text down with me here, but it's in chapter 71, and it starts out with, after these things he was taken up to heaven. Fine. Or he was taken up actually to that Son of Man. That's what the Ethiopic text reads. And then it starts over and says, and after these things, and it describes in great detail the ascent of this figure to heaven, of Enoch, apparently. No, it's also Enoch was taken up in the first case, but in the first case, he was taken up to that Son of Man. But in the second case, when he comes up, he is greeted by angels and finally by God, and God says to him, you are the Son of Man who has righteousness. That's where you get the idea that Enoch was the Son of Man. Is it right? I know. I think, I've played with different ideas on it. One thing is the Ethiopic is ambiguous. The Ethiopic can mean simply, you are a righteous man. it doesn't mean you are the Son of Man with capital letters. Son of
Right.
Man just means human being, person, something like that. And the one of the Ethiopic words that's used there, isn't the same as the one that's used in other passages about the Son of Man. So, I think that's an open question. Also, in the Ethiopic church, nobody thinks that's referring to Enoch.
Right. Of
Nobody
course.
says that Enoch is the Son of Man. They all think Jesus was the Son of Man. So they have to read it, the way I'm suggesting that what God says to Enoch is, Enoch, you're a good guy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I could see it meaning other things, and of
Yeah.
course they wouldn't want to read it any other way. But yeah,
And this is a point. We had seminars on this back nearly 20 years ago in the Enoch seminar, and there are good scholars who really think that Enoch is identified as the Son of Man.
right.
But I don't think that's right.
Okay, but I
And
also know that you put for the Enoch in the time of Jesus. You put it a century at least or two prior to Jesus, if I'm not mistaken. One
although
Enoch.
that passage in 1 Enoch, that's in the similitudes.
Mm,
And that, I think, is roughly from the time of Jesus.
okay.
We don't have an exact date for it. In fact, one of the possibilities that I played around with is that the passage that seems to identify Enoch as the Son of Man may be a reaction to Christianity. A subtle way of saying, no, it isn't Jesus, it's our man, Enoch. This too is a possibility. And again, I'm not confident of it, but
Don't rule it out. Thank you
yeah.
so much. We'll go to Q&A. Scott Duke in the house. Thank you, Scott, for the support. I'm so glad Dr. Collins is back. I'm in the middle of enjoying Introduction to the Hebrew Bible. Such a great read.
Good.
Thank you, Scott. Digital Hammurabi, Dr. Joshua Bowen, or the better half, Megan, thank you for the super chat. You can't find a better biblical scholar than Professor Collins. Get and read everything he writes. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that support. I highly recommend Dr. Joshua Bowen. He actually is the one initially who kept bragging about your work when I was just a complete ignoramus on all this subject matter. And he was like, you really need to learn this guy. So thank you so much for that. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for the support. I really appreciate that. Jehovah's Witnesses admit nobody was looking for Jesus to appear according to Daniel's prophecy. Evidently, nobody knew who he was, according to the Jewish Messiah, was supposed to be. It's pretty confusing.
Well, yeah, I guess I can agree with that. I think now this is switching a little bit to the question of what the Jewish Messiah was supposed to be.
Right.
As I see it, there was a standard job description, and Messiah should be big, strong man who is able to smash heads and drive out the Romans. And when you put it that way, you wonder, why would Jesus apply? And indeed, it's not at all clear that he did apply. But his followers came to believe that he was the Messiah. And then what they end up doing is saying, we got to rewrite that job description. And that's what they do in the New Testament.
Isn't the Apocalypse of John, though, trying to kind of still keep that job description, but it's in the after? It's like, here's the one that's, hair white as wool, and he's gonna come, he's gonna kick their, he's gonna kick some ass.
He's going to come back and do it right the next time.
So they can't let go of it. It seems this guy can't, at least.
I think that's true. Yeah.
Okay.
That's maybe another conversation.
Yeah, you've written a lot on that too. Constellation, thank you for the support and the indulgences to the Church of Myth Vision. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Doc Pleuromonot, good to see you here. I'm getting ready for a very sophisticated question here anytime he super chats. It is important to note that not all apocalypses contain apocalyptic eschatology, despite being colored by Daniel and Revelation, particularly with the SBL genre's project definition, revealing heavenly mysteries.
Now, first of all, let me say, as I use the expression apocalyptic eschatology, it means the kind of eschatology you find in apocalypses. Now, so that if you start out with the fixed idea that apocalyptic eschatology is the end of the world, well, okay, you're not going to find that in all of them, but that's a problem with your having a preconceived idea of apocalyptic eschatology that isn't derived from the apocalypses. So I think it makes more sense to use apocalyptic eschatology for the kind of eschatology you get in the apocalypses. And I'd say the most constant feature of that is the judgment of the dead. Now, you're right, of course, that they don't all have this historical sweep, and they're not all talking about the end of history, but they do have something in common. This again might be, another conversation.
I was actually going to pull up your Apocalyptic Imagination book because there's actually a screenshot of an image where you put check marks next to the kind of genre, and you literally specify a whole list of different apocalypses. But if you don't have the Apocalyptic Imagination, which I suspect Doc does, but if you're watching this and you're interested, go on Amazon in the description, check out the Apocalyptic Imagination book. He has checked off like which of these actually talks about the dead, or maybe even into the world, judgment of the wicked, the whole nine. You find those lists. So